What is absolutely mad is that the Chancellor has tied her hands so severely that we're speculating about how she could scrape money from really, really small taxes and do things that actually might be pretty bad in an overall tax design point of view. I mean, as we said long before the last election, you don't want to be tying your hands on the big taxes, because even if you genuinely don't want to increase them, you never know how the world's going to change. You might have to go back to find some tax rises for reasons you didn't expect. And you want those policy tools on the table, and here we are.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're going to discuss the spending review and what the settlements announced by the Chancellor might mean. Let's start with just a little bit of background. The spending review that we heard on Wednesday was not telling us anything new about the total amount that the government's going to spend. It was simply allocating the totals that the Chancellor had already announced, allocating for day-to-day public service spending through to 2028-29, so for next year, the year after, and the year after that, and for capital spending for 1 year further on than that. And broadly speaking, we heard what we expected. Over the next 3 years, day-to-day public service spending will increase by 1.2% a year, and capital spending will increase by rather more than that. Over the Parliament as a whole, spending is going to increase rather faster than that, because we saw about 2.5% increases in real day-to-day spending last year and this. And actually very striking and something to bear to keep an eye on is that even going forward, the spending is very much front-loaded. So 1.8% increases in 2026-27 and then only 1% each year after that. If I were a betting man, I would bet on some of those numbers being topped up. Chancellor focused on capital spending. It's worth saying that capital spending is capital spending is buying big bits of equipment, building things, roads and hospitals, and buying tanks and fighter aircraft, those sorts of things. That is at a high level by historic standards in the UK. It's going up a little bit under this government. The last government really brought it up to this high level. This government is maintaining it there, broadly speaking, as a fraction of national income. There's quite a contrast between that and the apparent plans of the previous government to cut it fairly significantly over the period of this Parliament. I'm not going to say more about the background to the review, because that's what we're here to discuss in more detail. So joining me to dissect those details are Ben Zaranko, Associate Director here at the IFS, and Helen Miller, Deputy Director for now, but soon to be Director, stepping into my shoes. Ben, Helen, welcome. Right, let's start. And Ben, I think I gave a reasonable overview of the very high level just then, but perhaps you could give us a little bit more of that bird's eye picture of what happened. How much extra spending did we get? What are the headlines? Very broadly speaking, how did the Chancellor decide to allocate that additional spending?
Okay, I think there's three big headlines. I'll limit myself to that. The first is that the government's keen to focus on the increases over the full Parliament, because when Rachel Reeves took office last year, she provided big cash injections for lots of public services in the short term, and then spending was set to slow down a little bit. So the Parliament's almost happening in the government calls them two phases, where phase one is more generous, phase two slightly less generous. Yesterday, I'm recording this on a Thursday, the Wednesday spending review was about allocating the budgets during phase two. And there, things were broadly as expected. The NHS and defence were the biggest winners in cash terms. Those are two big budgets. So you might expect them to be the big winners, but they were actually prioritised relative to other departments. I think that's the second thing to stress. And that means that other areas that were not health and defence faced a little bit of a tighter settlement for the most part. Some areas actually facing outright cuts. Some areas facing basically a plateauing budget over the next couple of years. And I think the other big thing to come out of yesterday was the allocations on capital investments. We knew that this government wanted to put a lot more emphasis on capital investment, willing to borrow more to make that happen. And we found out where that's going to be going. And we discovered it's primarily defence and it's green energy and net zero. Those are the two biggest areas of increase on capital funding, rather less in the way of increases for things like transport. There were some increases for science and technology that were genuinely quite chunky, but still dwarfed by the increases for defence and net zero. So I think that tells us something about the government's priorities, where we knew the big picture, more borrowing, more investment, thinking about the long term. That's now been spelled out in black and white where it's going to go.
It's just worth reflecting on the scale of change over this period. If we look at the departmental spending, which is what Chancellor was talking about, that's going up by between the beginning of this decade and the end of the decade by about 3% of national income. That's an historic change, really, in the size of what the government's providing in terms of public services. And alongside other increases in spending on things like debt interest is a really big change in the size of the state over this period. So I think anyone who's talking about this being a period of austerity is not really focusing on what's actually happening. That doesn't mean there's lots of money for all of the things that we might want to do, but we're certainly not in any sense cutting back on the size of the state. We're growing it really quite fast over this period.
Given that, Paul, is it worth sort of saying to people why, despite the fact that we're growing the state quite a lot, it's still going to feel pretty tough in lots of areas, right? And that's partly because needs and demands are also rising. So the state is growing a lot, but we also have an ageing population that wants more and more expensive health and social care. We have a higher demand for the provision of special educational needs for our children and so on. So I think when people hear the state is growing, they might expect, well, that's great. There's lots more to go around. We can solve lots of these problems and we can solve some of them. But spending pressures are increasing too. And one thing I was struck by is the fact that the government had started the parliament with these big 5 missions, and they weren't using the language of the missions yesterday, really, at least not in the speech. They're kind of there if you look for them.
You have to look pretty hard.
Yeah. But take the NHS as a good example. Maybe we'll come on to this. The NHS, as Ben was describing, a kind of a winner in cash terms, but still not nailed on that with that money they'll be able to meet their ambitious targets around getting waiting lists down, for example. So even with the state rising quite a lot, the government might still fall short of achieving its kind of underlying stated objections to increase what the state is doing.
I think that's really important, and there's been a lot of discussion about how the NHS has yet again scooped the ball, and in a sense it's true in terms of the amount of money that's going to it. But we absolutely have to take account of the increased demands on it. And just diving down into that a little bit, Ben, I think your work suggests that even with all of that additional money, we still might struggle to meet the government's objectives to get waiting lists down.
That's true, but I think that largely reflects the sheer ambition of the government's targets for waiting times. This was made before taking office and maybe before having access to the full modelling capacity of the department.
Well, they had access to your modelling there.
They did, but sadly, not everyone's poring over our reports in as much detail as you'd hope. But in fairness, we didn't actually do the modelling of this until more recently, so I'll let them off on that front. But the point is that trying to get waiting times back to the 18-week standards, and 92% of patients waiting less than 18 weeks for their pre-planned hospital care in England, that's just, from where we are now, that is just a heroic ambition to try and do that in one parliament. It relies on the NHS really pulling out all the stops, doing some ruthless prioritisation in terms of which patients you see when to try and get the most adhere to that target. And then also think about trying to reduce demand on the system by, well, ideally making people healthier, but also shoving them into other routes and other care pathways. Even if you do all of those things, it still looks like a stretch. And so the NHS budget is going up by 3% a year over and above inflation. Now, that compares to about 3.5% long run average. That compares to 2% and a bit over the past 14 years. So it's somewhere in between the two. This is all predicated on the NHS delivering productivity improvements of about 2% per year, which will be crucial if the NHS is to get anywhere near that waiting times target. Even if they deliver on those 2% improvements, the scale of the fall off in productivity after the pandemic means that by the end of the parliament, we'll only just be back to where we were pre-COVID in terms of hospital productivity. So you need to unwind that pandemic hit to productivity, ideally go further. And even then, they still might not get there. They might get some of the way there. Patients might have a better experience, but that health ambition is really just strikingly ambitious. It's good to have stretching targets, but it wouldn't shock me at all if we're sat here in oh, sorry, Paul, you won't be sat here, but in a few years' time saying, oh, they're making progress, but not fast enough.
It's I'm never quite sure what to think about it when targets are set which don't look achievable. I mean, the 1.5 million new homes target also doesn't look achievable. It would be great if it were achieved. It's good, as you say, to have a stretching target. But the government is really setting itself up for a bit of a fall, because you could imagine come the run up to the next election, there'll be a lot of ammunition to go at them for failing to achieve what they promised that they would achieve. On the other hand, they will unquestionably have made significant progress towards these targets, so they'll be able to point out that they've got somewhere there. So, as I say, I think you can decide whether it makes sense to have unattainable targets simply as a way of really focusing what you're trying to achieve. So, health is one area which the increases in funding have been quite significant. But if I had to guess, I think they will be topped up further, particularly as we get close to the next election. And we know that health funding always gets topped up. For one thing, the public's demand is pretty much insatiable. The demand for the NHS is insatiable.
Though, just to push back ever so slightly, normally at a spending review, the whole envelope gets topped up in part to give the NHS more cash. And this time, the Treasury stuck bang on its envelope. They said, here's how much we're going to spend, here's our limits, and they've adhered to them. That's a difference from the past. And if they can do that with the NHS as well, maybe we'll all be living within our means.
They didn't have a choice this time, given this wasn't a fiscal event. They had no OBR oversight, and there was no room against their fiscal rules. So that wasn't a surprise.
They chose the sequencing. They chose to do it in between fiscal events, with probably one eye on making that
But
easy
we've got
to
another
do.
spending review in 2 years.
Another difference, of course, since we're throwing him in the ring, is that we're also trying to increase defence spending. Right? And historically, we haven't been doing that historically. So in some sense, the NHS was the thing that always got prioritised. And now if we're trying to do both of them, that is going to be harder to find top-ups for defence and for the NHS potentially.
And I think, again, defence spending looks like another big winner this time. It's going up to 2.5% of national income. But again, I think slightly counterintuitively, it's probably going to be one of those areas where the pressure grows further, because what we're achieving is getting to that 2.5% of national income in 2027 and then sticking there. And yet the pressure is, the government's already said it wants to get to 3% of national income. There's increasing pressure internationally to get 3.5% of national income. So another area which looks like it's been a winner, but may actually turn out not to be enough.
And obviously, we're not politicians, but I can imagine that being a politically tougher sell as well, because the government going to the public and saying, we'll top up for the NHS because everyone loves the NHS is a pretty easy sell. The government saying we have to spend more money on defence in the run up to the next election, it's not obvious to me that's going to be the thing that on doorsteps makes people think, yes, this is great.
It might do in Derby and Barrow-in-Furness.
They may do. And they may feel compelled to do it nevertheless, but it's not clearly going to be the big political winner.
As Ben says, where they're actually building the warships and tanks and so on.
All those nice marginal constituencies that got name-checked yesterday.
This might look more attractive. But actually that's something I know you're keen on discussing, Helen, which is that essentially all of the increase in defence spending is on what counts as capital spending. So it's basically for big bits of kit. So we're not increasing the amount we're going to be spending on the number of soldiers and sailors and people in the Air Force. Where the increase is entirely focused on what officially counts as capital spending. And that makes it easier to do within the fiscal rules, but it's very different from the what's there in defence spending at the moment. That's I think something like 40% capital spending, and the additional is something like 90% on capital. Now, that fits better in the fiscal rules because the Chancellor says it's fine to borrow to invest because that gives us benefits in the long run. We've got the buildings and the roads and so on later on. The future generations benefit from that. Getting into the sort of the weeds of, or perhaps not the weeds, perhaps the high level philosophy behind these.
No, let's get into the weeds.
Can we start with the high level philosophy?
We'll start with the high level philosophy. We'll descend to your level later, Ben.
Look, I think there's two issues to unpack with the investment spending. So one is just, have the government picked good things to invest in? And I have absolutely no idea whether they should invest in submarines or tanks or drones or whatever it is. I'm going to leave that to the people who are experts in military techniques. But regardless of what they're spending in, the other question is, should we be borrowing money to cover that spending rather than raising it from our current resources. So basically raising more in taxes or finding cuts elsewhere. Big picture, Rachel Reeves was very keen to add up all her investment spending over the period and say she's going to spend £113 billion more on investment, less keen to add up all the borrowing and say she's going to borrow £140 billion more over the Parliament. Basically, she's borrowing all the money she needs for that investment, plus a bit more for some day-to-day spending in the early years. So I think the question is, should we be borrowing for that money, all that money to fund those investments? And I think if you're pointing to really growth-friendly investments, I think you can make a really clear case that says you put money into something like a piece of transport infrastructure that has a great impact on growth and therefore it's a good thing for us to invest in, drives up the growth rate, everything gets easier. But it's not a free pass to say that whatever you put into the capital bucket is growth friendly and therefore just because you can do it within the fiscal rules doesn't mean you should borrow more for that. And with defence spending, I'm sure there are some bits of that defence spending that you can say is going to increase growth a bit, although it's not the main aim of it.
Is it?
I mean, it's if we thought that defence spending was the way to drive up growth, we could have been building submarines or tanks 10 years ago and that we weren't making the case, right? So
Would have been a bizarre thing to do if we didn't really think we needed them for
clearly
other
the reason
reasons.
you're doing defence spending is because you want defence spending, not because you think it's the single best way to focus on growth. But some of that spending, to me, I wonder why are we borrowing for it? So we're not willing to borrow to pay for soldiers' wages, but we are willing to borrow to have drones. Or similarly, if we think that defence is really important and you should borrow for it, why are we willing to borrow for drones but not borrow for soldiers? I worry we're just not having big enough conversation about why are we borrowing to fund this spending as opposed to raising taxes for it.
Your point really is that this is a permanent increase in spending, and that will lead to a permanent increase in borrowing if we do it this way, or indeed crowd out other sorts of infrastructure spending. So normally when we talk about permanent increases in spending, which aren't really about growth, we would think, well, if we want this now, we probably ought to pay for it through taxes.
Okay, staying at the high level philosophy for a minute before I descend and drag us into the weeds. So I think you can make an argument for why it's okay to borrow for a bit during the transition, right? There's a classic argument about tax smoothing. If you start jacking up tax rates straight away in big amounts, it distorts behaviour. You might want to adjust taxes slowly. So even if we end up funding this all through taxes eventually, while we're on the path adjusting towards this new world of higher defence spending, you can make a case for borrowing a little bit. You can also, there's an academic literature on the growth benefits and spillovers from defence spending. Now, admittedly, that's mostly about the US military and accidentally inventing GPS and semiconductors and radar and stuff. I don't know whether we're going to manage to do something similarly transformative. Let's hope so, but I'm not sure that all of the defence spending will be similarly growth friendly. But a lot of this comes down to this sort of clunky distinction between what we can borrow for and what we can't. So it's based on accounting definitions of what's current and capital. And we use those as shorthand for sort of the capital spending is a shorthand for long-term spending that provides benefits to the economy and to people over the long term. It doesn't always work like that. And I think that there's aspects of current or day-to-day spending, like maybe childcare or early years investments, that might be more growth-friendly than building a submarine. But, as we admittedly were in our sleep-deprived state last night, but we did all agree that getting invaded by Russia probably would be bad for growth. So you have to zoom out a little bit as well and think about what we're doing this for.
But it's not to say we shouldn't do any of these things, right? The government's making choices. And I'm not even suggesting that we go as far as trying to have some kind of growth-friendly category and not. I mean, I think capital and current is a good split. I just think you shouldn't get a free pass. It shouldn't be the case that once you've called something capital, you can just borrow for it, and nobody scrutinises that because it's capital. It gets into the good bucket, and therefore you just borrow for it, and it's fine. I think there are going to be plenty of capital investments where it's really hard to justify borrowing for it, and we should just, if you want to do it, great, justify it and pay for it.
Maybe especially so when borrowing costs are high and indeed rising.
Yeah, it's not free.
So the judgment of whether we should be borrowing for a particular project or not should have regard to the cost of that borrowing. Now, there'll be people listening who think, well, interest rates were basically zero for a while. For a while, real interest rates were negative. We should have been borrowing and investing in all those things then. And, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but yeah, maybe.
It's also not just a case with defence, right? I mean, Ben created last night a beautiful chart that we should tweet later so you can all see, putting the categorising investment into different buckets.
It's already out there on X and on Blue Sky.
There you go. And we all enjoyed watching him create, compare the areas of different circles. So the point being here, defence was a big winner, but so was net zero, and there's a similar issue there. there might be great reasons to do the net zero investment, not necessarily pro-growth. Part of what that investment is doing is just doing the same thing we currently do, create electricity in a greener way, not necessarily going to make you any more growth friendly. Or lots of investment on the public services. So, I'm all in favour of fixing school roofs. That's a good thing to do. I don't want our nation's children being crushed under crumbling roofs. But if that's the kind of thing that we think actually you need to maintain the public estate, why are we borrowing if we think we permanently need to have some maintenance on the public estate? It's not clear to me that that shouldn't be something we just think of. We just foot the bill for that.
Yeah, maintenance is a bit like consumption, really, if we're doing the philosophy bit again. It's, we should be paying our way to maintain the services and buildings that we're all using. One of the really big winners on public services was lots of building on prisons to expand prison places. Now, by all accounts, it seems that we need to do that, right? Prisons are full. We need to have more places, but it's not growth friendly. It's not. If you were designing a program from scratch to try and boost UK productivity, I'm not sure I'd be building mega prisons in the countryside of Hertfordshire or wherever it is. It's just not what I would be focusing on.
And of course, what you thought the government might have focused is on, science, technology, infrastructure and transport. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, in Ben's nice chart, they're actually relatively small. I mean, they're bigger than the past. But if you looked at that chart and you asked people to guess what's the growth, what's the government's big priorities, you wouldn't look at that chart and say, obviously, growth is the number one mission.
You'd say defence and net zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Did you want to drag us any further into the weeds on that one, Ben, or should we move on to something else?
I'm happy to stay out the weeds for now.
Oh, marvellous.
Actually, no, one more
No,
thing.
he's not. No, he
No,
can't,
I'm not.
he
Is it the
can't
discount
stop
rates?
himself.
Oh, no, I'm the part of the discount rates. That can be a future podcast. No, one other thing on the investment front is there was a sort of little commented upon expansion in use of financial transactions as a way of making investment happen. So, the regular listeners to the IFS Zoom may have heard the phrase "persnuffle," which is Rachel Reeves has changed the measure of debt used for her fiscal targets, which basically, long story short, is kinder to policies that involve creating financial assets. So if you loan out lots of money, or you do financial guarantees, or you take equity stakes in businesses, that's treated more kindly by the fiscal rules. And indeed, we saw in the spending review an expansion of those sorts of policies via bodies like the National Wealth Fund, the British Business Bank, the new Great British Energy Organisation, I suppose it is. And that is another way that this government's trying to make investment happen, not through the traditional sense of government, sending out a contract to build a new prison, but these new financial instruments, which I think is this is probably the first step of many, but it was a notable change.
Can you drag us a bit further into the weeds on that one? I'm not sure. I mean, how should listeners understand that? I mean, is that really government spending, but just sort of hidden a bit, or is it really something which is appropriately not counted against debt?
Well, for the counting against debt, it depends what the question is. So it's about it's about which assets and liabilities you want to include when you're looking at the government's balance sheet, and it's taking a broader look that includes some government financial assets as well as just its financial liabilities. So if the government owns a stake in some sort of nuclear submarine startup, and it takes a stake in that, the financial value of that will be counted on one side of the ledger, as well as the debt you take on to buy that stake. And what the government's doing through lots of these bodies is the government's borrowing a bit, it's providing an initial injection of cash, and then these bodies are sort of taking that and loaning it out multiple times, issuing multiple guarantees in the expectation that not all of them will go bad. Some of them will. You got to keep allowances for that, like any bank does. But you can sort of leverage that and expand your financial footprint to have a bigger impact than the initial injection of cash would suggest. And it's about this National Wealth Fund in particular is a big part of how this government's thinking about a more interventionist state. The state, picking winners, taking stakes in things, trying to pick sectors it wants to push on with. And this is one, mechanism for making that happen that meets the new government's fiscal rules, which have been designed with that in mind. And it's a sort of slight change of approach, I suppose.
It's counting the value of the stake that you have. So as you say, you lend some money to someone or something, and you don't just you add what you've lent to your debt, but you net off the value of the thing that you've lent it to. And the big initial sort of impact of this is the way that we treat student loans, which
Exactly.
hundreds of billions actually of our national debt is money, at least some of which will be repaid by graduates, and the new rules actually count that expected repayment as an asset against the financial debt. And you can think about that in terms of, maybe as you say, lending money to someone who's building windmills or submarines or what have you. If you've got a stake in the person you're lending it to, then you count that as an asset as well as the amount that you've lent.
Yeah. If you describe it this, it all sounds like perfectly sensible and very positive, but there are weird things about this new debt measure as well, which maybe we don't want to get into now, but it's not all positive is what I would say. There are risks associated with this too.
I can tell that Ben really does want to get.
Looking through, let's not do for snuffle, but looking through the kind of corrects of how you measure it, the important point really is that you have to believe the government's going to make good investments. So regardless of how you count it and whether you can do it within your fiscal rules, the question is, has the government got good ideas for good investments it can make that either have direct financial payoffs or that have broader payoffs in society that mean it can catalyse some new industry or do something? That's really the question. The government has found a way to make direct investments, and we have to hope they're going to pick good ones.
Other countries do this, it's worth saying.
They do. We probably ought to move on to, there's an awful lot more that we could cover, and I think actually what we've covered is really important and nowhere near enough discussed. As people will, I hope, have gathered, that whilst, as we've heard, there's quite a lot of money going to defence and health, but maybe not enough. We'll wait and see. There are some other areas with some quite interesting things going on. So, for example, schools are getting some more money in the context of the numbers of kids at school going down. So actually the school's budget is reasonably flat, but because there are fewer pupils, there's more money per pupil. The risk is that may be difficult to make savings off that basis, and we know that we're spending more and more on special educational needs. So there are risks around the school's budget. Local government is getting some more money, but most of the money that you see in the Treasury's numbers is actually coming from increases in council tax. So the expectation is that council tax will rise by 5% a year each year for the next several years. Helen, just in 30 seconds, tell us why council tax needs reform.
It's based on values from 1991 and it's regressive. Both of those two things are stupid.
That's all you need to know. So, it's a really important point. Council tax we've lived with for 35 years now, nearly, in its current form. If we're going to rely on it more and more, as we are, actually, it's paying for a bigger and bigger fraction of local government spending. It becomes more and more important to reform that. I'm not holding my breath. However,
one other thing on local government is, and it relates to the council tax question, is I don't think that the actual amount of money provided to local government as a whole is the most important question here. I think the more important question is how that money is going to be allocated, where the government's embarking upon some much needed and very welcome reforming of the way that finance is allocated across different councils. And the key point here is to boil it down is just because the areas that can raise the most in council tax, because you've maybe got the nicest big leafy houses, aren't necessarily those that are facing the biggest pressures on their budgets, in particular from adult social care. There's no reason to think that those two things would coincide. And so you have to redistribute money across the system somehow. The way we do it at the moment is, out of date, and has all sorts of perverse effects. And the government wants to update that. If you were to revisit council tax, let's not get ahead of ourselves, it doesn't seem very likely, but if you were to do that, that's all bound up in the same question. But I think that for local government, I would be focusing more on the finance reform than the envelope in the spending review.
And we're going to hear details of the finance reform later this summer? Later this year?
I believe so, at least the sort of first stages of it.
It's another real bugbear of ours is that local government finance reform has been promised for, I think, almost a decade now. I think the last government in about 2016 said it will be done and dusted by about 2019, and then they kicked it past that election, and then they kicked it past the last election, and that's why the whole thing is hopelessly out of date and a horrible mess.
And it's worth just pointing out for those who aren't seeped in this stuff like we are, local government, people think of it as being like bin collection, and they do that, but the reason local government's having a problem is because it's facing some of the biggest spending pressures we're coming up against, right? So the big social care pressures we're seeing for adult and child social care is sitting with local government, and therefore it's one of the areas of government that is having these big increase in pressures on what it's being asked to do.
Yeah, and homelessness in some areas is a big acute pressure. Special educational needs demand for those services, big budget pressure, and lots of councils are struggling to make the sums add up. And it'll be a growing sort of rumbling issue over the next few years.
It's very striking that the fraction of their budgets going on these sorts of things has grown enormously in recent years. And it's really budgets going on sort of, almost crisis management. So those people who need social care, children who need social care, people who become homeless. So most of us don't see the benefit. But the large majority of us see no benefit from all of this spending. And we see, as Helen says, we see our bins being collected less and less frequently and the potholes being not filled. And that's not because local authorities don't want to do it. It's because the pressure on them elsewhere is just so extraordinary. But because we don't see that they're doing that, we don't value it, and there's a risk that they get neglected. Another bugbear is social care, isn't it? The sort of let me get this out of my system. We are speaking in the week in which Rachel Reeves completely backtracks on what she did just under a year ago on the winter fuel payment. The winter fuel payment, a couple of £100 a year to pensioner households, as was. Getting rid of that saved about £1.5 billion a year. At that same, and it's been politically terrible for them. Taking any money away from pensioners appears to be virtually impossible. At that same time last year, she also announced that she was binning social care reforms that everyone apparently had agreed on before the election that would have made the system more rational. It was a much, much bigger announcement. It's had zero political cost. The government has now kicked the whole issue into the extremely long grass with a review, which I think is due to, is it 2028 or 2029? It's not even reporting until
It's
then.
in multiple stages, but nothing will change until 2030s at the earliest.
So it's kicked into the next parliament yet again. Whatever might be the rational thing to care about, and I really do rationally care about what happens to the social care system, it's always deprioritised by governments because most of us, most of the time, don't have to interact with that system.
But when you do interact with it, it's absolutely crucial.
And absolutely hideous.
A bit like the justice system in some ways. But I wonder if this is there's a broader point here about why people seem to feel such dissatisfaction with public service performance. In some ways, it's because everything's got worse. But I wonder. Well,
Just that small point.
Well, that's it. Yeah. No, but I suppose there's also this point that it feels like I don't know if this is empirically true. So maybe someone maybe in this building should look into this. But it feels like Spain's becoming more concentrated on a smaller set of people. As you said, it's this crisis management thing, particularly in local government, where if it's a very small number of people with acute needs who need support, whether it's those with severe learning disabilities or people who are homeless or people with, on the NHS, it might be regular users of A&E, maybe those with substance abuse problems, things like that. If it's a small number of people getting social care, but the bins and the libraries and the planning and, I can't get my council to deliver me recycling bin bags. When you want the core services delivered and they're flailing because there's a small set of the population who are sort of requiring increased resources. I don't know if that lies with some of the dissatisfaction people feel, and I guess that partly relates to an older population means that if you're of working age relying on bits of the state, it doesn't work as well.
I think that I think there's that is clearly what's going on in local government.
Yeah.
And there's certainly aspects of central government where that's true. The big increase in disability benefit payments now. It's an increasing number of people relying on that, but obviously a small minority of the total. That costs the state a lot of money. But most of us don't see the benefits. Most of us don't see the benefits from that. So I think there is certainly something going on there. But maybe that's maybe the next project to look at how much of an impact that is. We probably ought to zoom out again to what happens next. So as we've said, we didn't in a sense really learn anything new about total spending, but these spending numbers are now pretty much nailed in. It's going to be incredibly hard for the Chancellor now to come back and say, actually, NHS, you're not getting 3% a year, or you're getting 2% a year, or actually, the justice system is going to get less than would be announced. So that's pretty much nailed in. What's also nailed in is the fiscal rules, which are, quotes, ironclad, and it would be, I think, impossible for the Chancellor, frankly, to remain in place and move away from those fiscal rules. So that leaves us, and it's worth saying we're meeting those fiscal rules by essentially nothing, and we're just meeting them with no room to spare. So you've got three moving parts when you come to fiscal policy. You've got spending, well, that's nailed in. You've got your fiscal rules, well, they're nailed in and barely being met. The only thing that's left is tax. And Helen, I think that's why accompanying this spending review, even though it's not a fiscal event, there's been an awful lot of speculation about, well, what might this mean for the budget that's going to come in the autumn?
Yeah. And speculation was happening rightly long before the spending review. And actually, what we heard yesterday didn't change anything about that, really. And it's happening because there was always going to be a good chance that come the autumn budget, the Chancellor will effectively receive a growth forecast from the Office Budget Responsibility that is less good than the one she got previously. And there's a few reasons for that. Partly it's because the official forecaster is more optimistic than other forecasters, and there was always a chance it would move back in line with the pack and therefore become less optimistic than previously. And other things have happened, like Donald Trump's been slapping tariffs on other countries. So even before the spending review settlement was announced, it was looking like it was possible that you'd get to autumn, growth would come down, therefore projected tax revenues come down, and you're no longer meeting this rule that says you want to have revenues covering spending. Again, yesterday didn't change that, it was just an allocating of the spending, but it is true, like you said, that once we get to whenever the budget's going to be in the autumn, if growth is more disappointing than in previous forecasts, and if you keep spending fixed, you could change welfare spending, you could reduce that, but we just said they can't touch pension as it seems. There's already, rumblings about not wanting to go ahead with disability cuts. Maybe there'll be pressure to actually increase welfare spending on things like removing the 2-child limit, so hard to see how they're going to find big cuts in the welfare budget, and therefore, like you said, what's left is the tax rises.
Now, some people have said that, I've heard quite a lot of people say, the tax rises are nailed on, they're inevitable, they're inescapable. I don't think that's right. I think there is a better than 50-50 shot we'll get tax rises, but it really does depend on what the forecasts for the economy are. And things haven't often got better, but they might get better over the next few months.
They definitely might. I think it's worth reflecting on. It's a bit silly that we're here. That everything depends on.
A very deep existential statement.
You thought you wanted more philosophy in the podcast and less weeds. But it's a bit silly that everything relies on what this one highly uncertain forecast for the economy and where it's going to be in a few years' time basically governs everything. Forecasts always move around. They're inevitably volatile, particularly so when you've got someone like President Trump in the White House. And then we've set up a framework and a sort of process that means that any volatility in the forecast just gets mainlined straight into our tax and spend policy. It almost has to follow one for one.
Well, but on this occasion, that is largely because the Chancellor just left herself with no space for manoeuvre against that. If she'd left herself more space, then we'd be less worried about it, I guess.
In large part, though, I'd also hazard a guess that if she left herself more space,
the pressure
pressure for her to top up spending from some of the more vociferous cabinet colleagues would have been all the more pronounced. And there's also a risk that, let's say she left herself, I don't know, 30 billion of, I hate the word, but I'm going to use it, but I want everyone to note that I hate using it, headroom. She's got, I want 30 billion of headroom against my fiscal rules. And she said, I think that's a sensible amount to have. Well, let's say the forecast moved and suddenly she only has 25 billion of headroom. And suddenly everyone goes, well, she has to do 5 billion of tax rises to get back to her special number. Like, we do just, whether through the debate, through the framework, through the sort of norms, have established these sort of arbitrary lines that then little moves in the forecast against them trigger policy responses. And, it winds me up.
Well, we know, Ben, that you're doing a review of all of this. So we're hoping to get some. When will we get the answers from your review?
Depends how many of the jobs and tasks you give me over the next couple of months. But if you leave me in peace, it'll hopefully won't be too long.
Another thing that's definitely mad, though. I mean, in some sense, having the tax system, move and adjust in some sense is what you might expect. Nothing's ever constant. You always want to change things. What is absolutely mad is that the Chancellor has tied her hands so severely that we're speculating about how she could scrape money from really, really small taxes and do things that actually might be pretty bad in an overall tax design point of view. I mean, as we said long before the last election, you don't want to be tying your hands on the big taxes because even if you genuinely don't want to increase them, you never know how the world's going to change. You might have to go back to find some tax rises for reasons you didn't expect. And you want those policy tools on the table, and here we are. may materialise. It may be the case that we want to find a big pot of money, and then we're all going to have to talk about, and the autumn talking about if she wants to do that, and if she doesn't want to touch the big taxes, how can we do it? And that's just a silly exam question to have set ourselves, I think.
But it is this exam question that the Chancellor has set herself. And as I say, I think given the way she's tied herself to these rules, it's going to be very hard for her to move away from them. It is also worth saying that these are not very tight rules. I mean, these are rules that are allowing us to maintain debt at about 100% of national income.
She's borrowing 140 billion extra.
Yeah,
borrowing
an awful lot.
And we don't have to get debt falling. We just have to promise to get debt falling in a couple of years' time.
And the new measure of debt.
So whilst she's tightly constrained by what are not particularly tight fiscal rules, and that reflects all of the problems that we've been talking about in terms of demands on the state and the fact that we are already raising quite a lot of tax,
and the fact we're spending about 2% of GDP more on debt interest than we were 5 years ago. It's about more than 50 billion quid a year.
50 billion more.
Well, 50 billion more, but you can do a lot with 50 billion quid.
Yeah, I certainly could. With the result, we're well over 100 billion a year in total on debt interest, which is wildly higher than the entire defence budget, for instance. A point we've made a number of times on this podcast, but I don't think you can make that point too often, given the constraints that it's creating for everything else. We have meandered around quite a lot of things over the last half hour, 40 minutes or so. Is there anything else either of you is desperate to get out of your system, however much in the weeds it might be, before we bid our listeners goodbye? Absolutely not. Excellent. I think they've been IFS zooms into submission.
Well, you let me get Persnuffle in early, so.
And I'm sort of resisting the urge to talk about tax reform because we'll have plenty of time to take up to the autumn.
Yeah, that's not the time or the place. Well, fantastic. A fascinating conversation as ever with Helen and Ben. There was a lot to chew on in that spending review. If you want to find out more about it, you can see our analysis on the IFS website. You can see, you can watch our colleagues Max Warner and B. Boileau go through their presentations of what happened. I think you will find all of that rather more enlightening than you might have found Rachel Reeves' speech on Wednesday, in which she rattled off such a huge number of numbers. I don't think any of us here really ended that speech any the wiser, but we certainly hope you will have been left somewhat the wiser by the discussion that we've just had, and indeed even wiser if you look at the additional material that we have on our website. So,
can I say one last thing, Paul?
Oh, yes.
Just in case any of the Treasury team who made the official document are listening, it was very good. It was very clear. Made our lives quite easy last night, so thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. You heard it here first. The IFS says thank you very much to the Treasury for being clear. And it's true. It really was a considerable contrast between the document and the speech. So thank you again to Ben and Helen. Thank you, everyone, to listening to us in our sleep-deprived state. None of us had more than a couple of hours sleep last night. I hope that wasn't too obvious from the way that we were meandering around this topic. If you enjoyed this episode, which surely you did, do subscribe in your podcast app and share it with anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, which surely you would, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. Just check the link in the episode description. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.